Bienvenidos, bienvenidas al 8º Congreso de Bibliotecas Universitarias y Especializadas organizadas por el SISIB. Veo que ya se está integrando mucha gente. Tenemos hasta ahora, bueno, va subiendo al minuto, al segundo, 245 participantes, gente de Valparaíso, Chile, de Uruguay, de México, Argentina, Brasil, Puerto Rico, así que están todos saludando en el chat. Buenos días, gracias por levantarse temprano donde estén, o quizás más tarde en otras latitudes. Primero me quiero presentar, soy Bárbara Rivera López, parte del equipo organizador del Congreso, y tengo el placer de darle la bienvenida hoy día y estar, ya que estamos en la primera jornada, de 3 jornadas hoy del Congreso. Agradecemos su asistencia a esta, que es la segunda versión online de nuestro encuentro. Claramente, yo creo que como todos extrañamos reunirnos presencialmente, pero que tomamos la decisión de continuar en esta modalidad para la seguridad de nosotros como equipo organizador y también para la seguridad de nuestros asistentes. Pero eso que estemos online no significa que no podamos interactuar, ¿cierto? Así que les queremos invitar a utilizar el chat y las redes sociales como un espacio de interacción con los colegas y los pares. Tenemos a Roberto Vera, que es parte de nuestro equipo organizador, en el chat, muy activo, va a estar saludándolos a todos, a todas, dándoles los links de las presentaciones y las referencias en el momento en que sea necesario. Y también podemos conversar por Twitter usando el hashtag #BiblioU2022. Y le invitamos a seguir a nuestra cuenta @SISIB_Chile en Twitter, y esta cuenta va a estar haciendo un tuiteo en vivo, sacando las mejores cuñas, y también se puede conversar por ahí. Vamos a estar retuiteando también los tweets con el hashtag #BiblioU2022. Y mientras se conectan los asistentes y las asistentes, que vamos en 293, saludos desde la PUCB, hola, desde Colombia también. Queremos saber un poco más de ustedes, nuestra audiencia que se inscribió por montones y está acá también con muchas personas activas, saludando e integrándose, esperando a nuestros panelistas. Me imagino que también muchos de ustedes se inscribieron a los talleres que van a estar en la tarde, o no sé, mañana o noche, depende de dónde estén. Y como los queremos conocer, queríamos saber si es que es su primera vez en nuestro congreso. Entonces, con estas tecnologías nuevas de Zoom, creo que les tiene que haber aparecido ya en su pantalla una votación, y queremos saber si es que ha participado o no en las versiones anteriores de nuestro congreso. Pensamos que ya estamos en el 8º, así que puede ser que ya hayan participado. Les vamos a dar algunos minutos, y mientras ustedes contestan, y ahí obviamente les vamos a mostrar los resultados de esto, quería aprovechar esos minutos para agradecer a nuestros auspiciadores y a nuestros patrocinadores. Por una parte tenemos IMTC Group, 𝗥cie Emerald Publishing, 𝗩𝗲𝗴𝘂𝗀, BMJ, Cambridge University Press, De Gruyter, 𝗩𝗲𝗴𝘀, IOP Publishing, McGraw-Hill, Oxford University Press, Libro, TM Springer Natures, Wolters Kluwer y Clarivate. Y también nuestros patrocinadores, algunos nuevos, otros que nos han acompañado desde las primeras versiones, Wikimedia Chile, la CAVID, el Colegio de Bibliotecarios de Chile, DOAG, la Escuela de Bibliotecología de la UTEM, la carrera de Bibliotecología de la Universidad de Playa Ancha, y la carrera de Gestión de Información, Bibliotecología y Archivística de la Universidad Alberto Hurtado. Veamos cómo nos fue con la votación, y mientras tenemos los resultados. Está dividido esto. Bueno, la mayoría parece votación de, ¿cómo se llama?, de elecciones, ¿no? Así que está bastante dividida la cosa. La mayoría, podemos decir que sí ya ha estado en nuestras versiones, y el 49% no ha estado. Bueno, felices de saludar nuevamente a aquellos que han estado antes con nosotros. Esperemos que esta versión les guste. Y para aquellos que no han estado, bueno, esperemos que esta sea su primera versión de muchas otras. Acá también hay gente de Osorno, de la Universidad Playa Ancha en Chile, de la Universidad Técnica del Norte de Ibarra en Ecuador, de Río de Janeiro, Brasil, 𝗖𝗹𝘂, de Perú. Y bueno, aprovecho de contarles también que estamos transmitiendo en vivo a través de nuestro canal de YouTube, 𝗖𝗍 𝗄𝗂𝐿𝐴, eso ponen en YouTube y se pueden conectar. Les cuento que ahí van a quedar alojadas las conferencias que tengamos hoy y de las siguientes 2 jornadas. De esta manera, como van a quedar alojadas ahí, las pueden consultar cuando gusten. Y les invito también a suscribirse a nuestro canal de SISIB, porque la versión anterior también la encuentran ahí, subtitulada en el caso de que hayamos tenido, y de hecho tuvimos, algunos invitados que hablaban en otros idiomas, y aquí Roberto entiendo que va a dejar el link de... ahí está. Dejó Roberto el link del canal de SISIB en YouTube. Hay muchos recursos, no solamente el Congreso, otras cosas que hemos hecho también, así que se los recomiendo. Y también contarles de que en estos 3 días, hoy día es el primero, nuestra programación es bastante variada. Tenemos conferencias que nos hablan desde la gestión de datos y su relación con la ética, pasando por el futuro de las bibliotecas, luego de las pandemias, de la pandemia, perdón. Tenemos conferencistas que vienen de Estados Unidos, bueno, no vienen, vienen virtualmente, ¿no es cierto? En Estados Unidos, Canadá, España, Reino Unido y también Chile. Y eso va a ser en las mañanas, las conferencias, y luego por la tarde hay una oferta de más de 20 talleres que pueden revisar en el sitio web del Congreso, y el link lo va a poner ahora Roberto en el chat. Les recordamos que los talleres son gratuitos, online, pero que tienen que poner atención que tienen que registrarse individualmente en cada uno de ellos. O sea, si es que se registran en uno, no sirve para todos los talleres, sino que solo se están registrando en ese taller. Y por último, y claramente no por ello menos importante, tenemos disponible una feria virtual de productos y servicios de información. La pueden encontrar en el sitio web del Congreso bajo Feria Virtual, y ahí podrán conocer a los proveedores, los productos y agendar reuniones. Roberto, entiendo que está dejando en el chat, aquí mismo, ahora mismo, para que ustedes puedan hacer clic y entrar a esta feria virtual para poder seguir su relación con los proveedores o conocer algunos nuevos. ¿Y qué más? Bueno, siempre es importante revisar algunos asuntos domésticos. Primero, contarles que las conferencias van a tener un espacio de preguntas al final. Estas preguntas pueden ser formuladas en el chat y también en Twitter usando el hashtag #BiblioU2022. La transmisión en YouTube, si nos están viendo por ahí, no tiene disponible el chat. Entonces, en caso que estén en YouTube, podrían utilizar las redes sociales. Y en el caso, porque hoy nos va a acompañar un conferencista que habla en inglés, ¿no? En el caso de que necesiten utilizar el servicio de traducción en vivo que tenemos, simultánea que tenemos, pueden encontrar el icono mundo, ¿no? Si es que ustedes ven en la conferencia, es un icono que hay como un mundo medio análogo, y donde dice interpretación. Ahí hacen clic y pueden ver una opción que dice español o inglés, y se meten al canal de español para oír la traducción. Una vez que eso finalice, la persona que está traduciendo se cambian al canal en el que estamos ahora para poder escuchar lo que nosotros vamos a decir, las preguntas que vamos a plantear y así. Entonces, luego de todo este preámbulo, de darles la bienvenida, de saber si es que estuvieron acá o no antes, de saludar a quienes se están integrando, ahora diría yo ya que somos, a ver, déjenme ver, ya somos 387 personas, 88. Damos comienzo oficial a la 8ª edición del Congreso de Bibliotecas Universitarias y Especializadas, con las palabras de bienvenida de nuestro director del SISIB, Rodrigo Donoso. Rodrigo, muchas gracias por estar con nosotros y te dejamos la palabra.
Muchas gracias, Bárbara, por toda la presentación, y también por darle la bienvenida a todo este grupo de colegas que nos estamos reuniendo hoy. Bueno, bienvenidos y bienvenidas a la 8ª versión del Congreso de Bibliotecas Universitarias y Especializadas, que organiza la Dirección de Servicios de Información y Bibliotecas de la Universidad de Chile. En estos tiempos que han estado marcados por la distancia física, ¿cierto?, y la crisis sanitaria, doblamos nuestros esfuerzos para volver a conectarnos, volver a reunirnos, sortear las barreras y sacar el máximo provecho a las tecnologías. Espero que todas y todos se encuentren muy bien y que pronto sea el tiempo de reunirnos. Es un agrado para nosotros, como SISIB y como comité organizador, la presencia de casi 400 bibliotecarios y bibliotecarias, investigadores y en general profesionales de la información, que se han hecho parte de este evento y con los que esperamos compartir las 3 jornadas. Hemos preparado 3 días de conferencia con temas que son relevantes, contingentes y cuya conversación es muy necesaria para el desarrollo de iniciativas, proyectos y, por qué no, del futuro de nuestra profesión. Abordaremos la ciencia y el acceso abierto, las plataformas editoriales y también cómo las bibliotecas enfrentaremos la pospandemia y los objetivos de desarrollo sostenibles y cómo estos van a afectar necesariamente nuestra actividad. Además, miraremos las oportunidades que tenemos como profesionales de la información para enfrentar los retos de la transformación digital y la gestión de datos en bibliotecas universitarias. Aprovecho de agradecer a todos y a todas quienes expondrán en estos días por su tiempo y dedicación. Por la tarde hemos organizado una serie de talleres que representan una alternativa de capacitación, también para conocer nuevos servicios y productos, así como para interactuar con otros profesionales de la región. Agradecemos desde ya, nuevamente como equipo organizador y como la Dirección de Servicios de Información y Biblioteca, su presencia, y desde ya los invitamos a participar activamente en las diversas instancias que tenemos preparadas. Muchas gracias y bienvenidos.
Rodrigo, te agradecemos tus palabras. Muchas gracias por darles la bienvenida a todos, contarnos un poco de lo que va a pasar. Y agradecemos tus palabras que dan inicio a este 8º Congreso. Ahora nos vamos a las conferencias y contarles que tenemos el honor de inaugurar nuestro congreso con un gran personaje llamado Jan-Claude Guédon, que nos acompaña desde Canadá. Voy a presentar a Jan-Claude, contarles un poco de su biografía, quién es, si es que no lo conocen, y invitarles a que se familiaricen con su trabajo, y ahora él nos va a contar un poco de lo que está pensando y las ideas que tiene ahora. Jan-Claude es profesor honorario de la Universidad de Montreal, Canadá. Sus principales áreas de investigación se relacionan con la digitalización de la cultura, la cibercultura, la publicación digital y las bibliotecas digitales. Durante su carrera ha estado involucrado en temas de acceso gratuito y abierto a investigaciones, archivos y software abiertos. Ha ganado importantes premios académicos y ha participado en más de 400 conferencias alrededor del mundo. Además, tiene más de 100 publicaciones académicas. Hoy Jan-Claude nos presenta la conferencia, que es una pregunta muy interesante, ¿no? ¿Deberían existir aún las revistas académicas digitales en un mundo de plataformas digitales? Jan-Claude, te invito, if you're there, can you open your mic and turn on your video, please?
Yes, I am.
Hey, Jan-Claude, I don't see you yet. Yes, there you are. Okay. So I'm going to say a little words before and I give you the pass.
Thank you.
Les recordamos que pueden hacer sus preguntas a través del chat y en Twitter utilizando el hashtag #BiblioU2022. Estas preguntas yo las voy a formular luego de la conferencia. Jan-Claude, thank you for your time. I know it's early there and also it's very cold. and you have your space now. I'm going to mute and shut down my video, and we are very ready and eager to hear your conference. So the floor is yours, as we say here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Barbara. And thank you for the good words. And welcome to everybody from tropical Montreal, where the temperature right now is -24°C. So you can put on your bikinis and go swim in the waters of the St. Lawrence whenever you want. I guarantee a very, very enlivening bath. So let's get going with the important things. Should academic journals still exist in a digital world? Oh, I'll stop immediately. I want to thank the organizers, of course, for this very kind invitation. I'm very honored to be with all of you today. And the second thing I want to say is my apologies for not speaking in Spanish this morning. My Spanish is very flaky, very weak, and I think it would turn out into more of a joke than anything else if I tried to do so. So my apologies, however. I love Spanish. So, should academic journals still exist in the digital world? Well, this is a question that would look absolutely obvious, and yet when you think about it, more questions emerge. Why do we have journals? Well, how did they emerge? How did scholarly journals evolve between their birth in 1665 and nowadays? What roles are they playing and at the time, and what roles are they playing now? Do they still play the same roles everywhere for everyone? And with network computers and the internet, do we still need journals? And once these questions are identified, there are more questions that come. For example, if the whole point of scholarship in general and of science in particular is to produce knowledge as distinguished from belief, knowledge, what are the processes at work to reach this objective? And how do journals position themselves with regard to knowledge production? Here again, the answer is far less obvious than it first appears. In the next half hour or so, I would like to review what is the process journals are supposed to support and enhance. And I would like to review whether in a digital context, journals still have a meaningful role to play. So let's go to the first slide, the great conversation and knowledge. Speaking about academic journals without examining their relationship to knowledge is nonsense. The first thing to remember is that journals emerge only to enhance the production of knowledge. Journals exist to serve knowledge, not the reverse. What we are going to observe is a gradual transformation of journals as tools of knowledge creation into tools designed to exploit knowledge production for other, mainly financial objectives. Knowledge, we know it all, is a slippery concept. It wields authority, but it is always tentative, incomplete, imperfect. If you search for certainty, knowledge will not work. Belief may fulfill your desire for certainty, but that works only if you believe in the act of believing itself, and that is a little problematic. Basically, hoping for certainty, in my opinion, is immature. The value of knowledge rests in its ability to predict something precise in a testable way. The weather report on everyday television is a reminder that meteorological knowledge finds ways to describe weather patterns and not just infinitely variegated forms of weather as a poet might achieve. And the conceptual ordering of reality that knowledge provides allows to predict tomorrow's weather. In short, knowledge takes the risk of predicting, although this very move may lead to its refutation. If the prediction unaccountably fails, the element of knowledge linked to the prediction is on its way to being refuted. Ultimately, it may be even abandoned or at least demoted, as Newton's knowledge was demoted by Einstein's knowledge. Knowledge is produced by human beings and only human beings. It exists only to the extent that it survives animated and robust debates. And the slide you have in front of you shows right now Lomonosov presenting his ideas to a group of German scientists in a very lively debate. And it becomes temporarily valid at the terms of these debates. For this reason, I like to describe the process of knowledge creation as the product of an ever-going great conversation. However, the level of validity of knowledge is also a function of the ways in which the great conversation is driven forward. If the great conversation is not well managed and well organized, the validity of the produced knowledge will be problematic at best. As we're going to see, present-day journals, particularly commercial scientific journals, do not manage the great conversation in the best interest of knowledge creation. There is nothing transcendental in knowledge creation, and hierarchic authority should not play any role either. By professional honesty, researchers report observations or results of experiments truthfully, but there is no truth as such in science or knowledge. A researcher deals only with reality, with discrete encounters with real objects or events, and reports those encounters in the form of a conceptually structured narrative, which usually presents itself as an article or a monograph. The narrative expressing knowledge is obviously an essential part of the process of knowledge creation, and it relies on a number of essential points. As in a court of law, the narrative makes the case for the others to see. As in a court of law, the narrative presented by the defense is reinforced by acceptable supporting evidence. As in a court of law, the narrative presented by the defense is submitted to various forms of criticism from the prosecution. They range from doubts about the supporting evidence to countervailing evidence. Accompanied by those various positive and negative elements, the case is finally rested for all to judge. On the basis of what has been added to the initial case, a collective decision gradually emerges. Either it provisionally accepts the case, or it refuses it, or it provides a new case somewhat different from the initial case. Then begins a new round of debates around a new narrative. The form of the court is of obvious importance, and in modern times, this court is largely associated to the notion of a journal. It used to act as a kind of knowledge court. Who owns the court? Who owns the journal? Who controls the proceedings? Who controls the journal? Who can speak? What form can any intervention take? These questions are fundamental to establish ultimately the validity of knowledge, and yet they are rarely examined for themselves. As a quick example, intervening around a table with a few colleagues differs from introducing a document into an archive. Which tools were used to copy the document? Who owns and controls these tools? What do these tools do to documents? In short, the great conversation rests on social and institutional elements where issues of wealth and power lurk in the background. The validity of knowledge, in other words, is constantly threatened by non-cognitive factors. Next slide, please. Scholarly knowledge, journals and knowledge. Historically, the great conversation evolved bottoms up. First, local city-based meeting groups, sometimes called academies, emerged, and they began to interlink thanks to growing postal systems. A republic of sort of learned individuals began to grow, supported by a great deal of letter writing. The printing press opened the possibility of bundling the letters into periodic releases that could be distributed more efficiently and more widely. Thus emerged the first scientific journals. In France, in January 1665, and in England, a few months later, the first recognizable scientific journals appeared. At first, the functions and roles of these journals were ill-defined. In some ways, they maintained the habits of letter writing, but the enhanced scale of dissemination that printing allowed also suggested the possibility of diffusing scientific knowledge into wider audiences, a kind of early science popularization in effect. Also, the status of such publication could vary significantly. When the French Academy began to publish its Mémoires et Histoire in 1699, it was in an imposing folio format congruent with the cultural ambitions of the French so-called Sun King. By contrast, the philosophical transactions of the Royal Society of London was issued in a much more modest format. The Royal Society had not officially endorsed the new publication. In the 19th century and early 20th century, society-based journals became the leading category of scientific publications. What developed was a model that deserves to be examined a little more closely. In effect, a group of researchers banded together to finance a journal. They provided themselves with a voice. At the same time, they also filtered their publications to protect their reputation. The copies of the journals that were printed could also be bartered against similar journals from other societies in the country and beyond. The result was that with one journal and some exchanges, a local research library could be maintained at a minimal cost. In the 19th and early 20th century, the positive role journals played with respect to the great conversation would not have been questioned. All the elements of scholarly research and those of publishing were correctly aligned together. In Latin America, this kind of alignment persists, and the importance of preserving it extends much beyond Latin America. Next slide, the growing divergence between scholarly communication and scholarly publishing. The 20th century saw very important changes take place in scholarly communication and publishing. The main points are the following. One, the public subsidies to research grew enormously with World War II and afterwards. The quickened pace of research resulted in a fast-growing demand for publishing space. Scholarly societies, for the most part, could not respond adequately to this demand. Two, the inability of scholarly societies to respond to the new publishing needs opens a new possibility for commercial publishers, mainly in Holland, the UK, and the USA. Three, commercial publishers quickly perceive that their best strategy lies in going global, thus moving well beyond the traditional reach of scholarly societies. Four, to engineer, and I mean engineer, an internationalized market of journal, publishers need to unify the language of research. English is the obvious solution. B, simplify the management of an international market of journals by organizing it almost exclusively with libraries. C, transform the reputation of journals into intellectual value and align it with their commercial value. This is achieved by creating a competitive system that works equally well and simultaneously on both planes. And that is a very crucial point, reaching this agreement between a commercial mode of functioning and an intellectual mode of functioning. This is exactly what the rankings of journals organized around the impact factor achieves. That's the role of the impact factor. It's to align the two planes, the commercial with the intellectual. Doesn't have any other role really. D, rally a significant proportion of leading researchers to the new publishing opportunities by offering them roles as editors or members of editorial boards of the new journals that are being created. As a result, the set of researchers is divided in two, one which corresponds to the new version, what you might call a burguesia compradora of intellectual stature. And then finally, you must reinforce the position of the new publishing structure by extending the reach of journal rankings into everything. the evaluation of individual researchers, laboratories, research institutions, in particular universities, and even whole countries. Show me a university administrator that is not obsessed by the ranking of his or her institution nowadays. Now, the consequences of this new system, which emerges between roughly 1950-55 and 1980-85, are enormous, really enormous consequences. One, competition is increasingly becoming the universal rule for the management of research. Two, the journal impact factor becomes the universal currency and standard of knowledge evaluation. Now we're evaluating really, so to speak, journals, but suddenly it becomes the evaluation of knowledge. Validation and evaluation of research are no longer treated separately. What does a journal provide nowadays? Validation, evaluation, both. Do all journals behave in the same way on this question? Obviously not. The evaluation through the impact factor leads to a very messy interface between editorial boards of journals and publishers, particularly when the publishers own the journal titles. Recently, Jason Winkler from Elsevier, in a statement that was amazingly transparent, admitted the following, quote, "Using Elsevier's analytical tools, I work with my editors, showing them which topics correlate with citations and which do not." In other words, he's showing his editors how to chase citations. 5, the use of the impact factor is also a very, very efficient tool to exclude. It excludes anyone that does not fit a certain globalized vision of knowledge creation. Think of the difficulties Latin American journals encounter when they seek to be indexed in the Web of Science or Scopus. 6, to be included, one has to conform to a number of rules, including the almost exclusive use of the English language. And again, I apologize for using English this morning. 7, the use of the impact factor also involves focusing on the research agendas of dominant research institutions in the world. The use of the impact factor to evaluate everything amounts to a covert science policy, a science policy that never announces itself publicly and openly as such, but it exists. Again, to revert to the same Elsevier executive, quote, "And I recommend practices that attract articles on certain topics from specific institutes and labs." Now, if that's not steering research from a publisher's standpoint, I don't know what is. Now, how do we correct the present situation, which is the slide now on the screen? The thesis of this presentation is that the present socio-political situation of scientific publishing is the result of the encroachment of the commercial sector, and that the ways in which scientific journals have been reorganized as both a merchandise and a vector of knowledge is the crucial element of the problem. The question we must ask, therefore, is whether journals are still useful in 2022. Since the 1990s, we have all witnessed the gradual transfer of our means of publication and communication into the digital sphere. Both commercial and non-profit organizations set up portals where users could find the journals and articles they were looking for. Gradually, these portals have evolved into platforms, which can be defined as portals, i.e., that is, virtual library shelves enriched by a variety of algorithms. These algorithms fundamentally work on 3 levels. First level, they shape the way individuals or groups interact with documents, production, organization, retrieval, and so on. Secondly, They shape the ways in which documents relate to each other, time, themes, citations, links, etc. Thirdly, they shape the way the documents work back on human interactions and shape human interactions themselves. Think of platforms such as Facebook or Meta nowadays, WhatsApp, Twitter, LinkedIn, etc. All these platforms affect the way we behave. Platforms are no longer viewed as beneficent devices, and this has had a very bad consequence. The academic world often appears to avoid platforms because of their negative possibilities and connotation, and that is easy to understand. However, they have become much too important to be dispensed with. The research world should learn how to design and use platforms in the best possible way to help knowledge, and that is the real issue. The rest of this presentation will be devoted to adumbrating some of the most salient and fundamental elements of platforms that support the production of valid knowledge. In so doing, we will also move from the open access issues that dominated many debates until recently and introduce a fuller notion of what open science can mean for the research world. So let's rethink the functions of publishing. A well-established tradition, sometimes referring all the way to Oldenburg, the creator of the philosophical transactions in 1665, summarizes the publishing functions as registration, certification, awareness or dissemination, and archive. In early 2019, an expert group by the European Commission, in which I had the privilege to chair, made the point that these functions could be treated separately and by diverse actors. The apparently monolithic facade of publishers, consequently, is a construct of socioeconomic forces. It's not a production, it's not a creation of the 8th day of the universe's creation. Disrupting this publishing construct became a distinct possibility with the rise of the network computer. Moving beyond the print world indeed opened the door to reorganizing the publishing processes, and a number of scholar-led experiments surfaced at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s. However, the debate was quickly skewed in a very unhappy direction. Going digital did open the door to the possibility of open access, but open access itself was quickly annexed as a way to battle the constant price increases of journals by, in particular, librarians. As a result, a majority of librarians embraced open access, but they did so from the perspective of institutions caught in the seller-buyer nexus that commercial publishers had foregrounded when they reshaped the world markets of scientific publications. Alas, open access was not the appropriate lever to reshape the commercial market of journals. Building institutional repositories was a great idea, but it would not convince publishers to behave on the pricing issue. Furthermore, librarians seemed to lose their bearings when publishers stopped opposing open access and began promoting a business plan based on article processing charges. The so-called transformative agreements, which came later, simply added to the confusion, and as all these business plans were missing a fundamental point: access either to reading or writing based on any form of payment cannot avoid creating forms of inequity that work against the great conversation. Another point increasingly grew obvious in the last 10 years. The money needed to keep commercial publishers satisfied was more than what was needed to build an alternative system of scientific publishing that would work for the healthy production of knowledge. However, a kind of energy barrier to use a metaphor borrowed from chemical reactions, had to be overcome. And that emerging energy barrier was easy to spot. It was based on the evaluation of scientific research by relying on journal rankings, which worked against any system that did not take the same journals as the pivot of scientific communication, and by inference, their publishers. Funding agencies have needed research evaluation to allocate grants, but like everybody else, they have come to rely on those citations inherent in journal competition, and rankings does not necessarily provide the results needed to implement a research policy into a well-focused research program. In other words, the evaluation process based on the prestige of publishing venues does not coincide with the needs of a national or regional funding agency, and the tensions between the modes of evaluation and the research programs is constantly growing. Now, the money supporting the whole research cycle has been concentrated in two different kinds of institutions. For the most part, this money comes from the funding agencies, but the publishing phase has largely been supported by libraries, paying for subscriptions, acquisitions of materials, and more recently for APCs. However, the cutting of research in two totally distinct phases has been increasingly questioned, with the result that some funding agencies are now testing the possibility of taking on some of the publishing functions. The ORE, Open Research Europe platform in the European Commission, is an example of such a publishing device, even though it harbors some problems of its own. The Wellcome Trust, as well as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, are also beginning to take on publishing functions. All these developments are very important to conceive a different publishing system, but more is needed, and this will be the main point of the next section. However, I want to underline one thing. In this general competition world that we live in, the funding agencies are far more insulated than are the universities or the laboratories or the individuals in general. So we have to rebuild the scientific publishing system and see the role of libraries. This is the next slide. Starting again with the basic functions of publishing: registration, certification, dissemination, and archive, we can immediately accept that libraries can take on the registration and archiving of the local intellectual production without any fundamental difficulty. With regard to registration, all that is required is a simple rule. Any researcher who wants to claim a piece of work for any purpose, such as tenure, promotion, institutional grants, etc., must simply register it with the local library. If it is not registered, it simply does not exist from the standpoint of the administration. This rule is similar to that used at the University of Liège in Belgium, except that in the latter case, Liège also requires a deposit of the corresponding document. For registration purposes, this is not even needed. The next step relies on the concept that was developed by Lorcan Dempsey at OCLC in the United States. It is the concept of the inside-out library. In this perspective, the library's main role, rather than bringing the information from wherever in the world to the local constituency of researchers, teachers, and students, the library collects the work of the local researchers in such a manner as to make these works findable and accessible to the whole world. This also means, for example, that if all the libraries or research centers in a given country or region work together to expose the products of their researchers, this will give rise to a considerable amount of literature being placed at the disposal of the whole world and being visible by the whole world. There is, however, two important questions to solve at this juncture, that of certification and that of evaluation. Well, it turns out that certification can be tightly related to the question of knowledge validation. Evaluation, on the other hand, is an entirely different kind of problem, which unhappily is often confused with validation. Let's start by clarifying what we mean by validation. Validation means, and that's the first point, that the piece of the work being exposed contains elements of knowledge that merit consideration by other researchers. A piece of work stamped with a seal of validity is to be taken as serious work. As is obvious, validation is what peer review should aim for. If peer reviewers and editors were not regularly mixing up validity with considerations about the status and prestige of the journal standing behind the process. In some ways, the validity phase can be likened to the kind of peer review that a mega journal such as PLOS ONE performs. What is tested in such a process is the competence of the work done. Is it work that one can rely on to pursue further work? That's first meaning of validation. Second meaning, validation can also deal with competent work that has reached negative or inconclusive results. Exposing such work would help other people not to repeat the same observations or experiments and thus save resources for the whole knowledge enterprise. Or alternatively, it could give warning to users that this work, although done competently, has not yielded convincing evidence that something is indeed the case. Incidentally, establishing that a probability value threshold at 0.05 is valid is, as 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗂 declares in his book, quite arbitrary. It would probably be much better to classify results by probability values without deciding if there is a threshold or not. Third element, validation should also include providing access to the relevant data supporting a piece of work so as to allow a better scrutiny of the exposed work, as well as all the tools needed to manipulate the data, in particular the software. The point of the great conversation is to allow repeating an experiment and check what kind of data is produced thereby. Publishing systems that do not allow for such simple requirements are simply not playing the right role for the production of valid knowledge. Validation itself may be a process in several stages. The point here is that the starting institution must network with a number of other institutions to begin the process of a critical process that will have some credibility beyond that network. Evaluation, for its part, is an entirely different process. Unlike validation, that should work in the same fashion anywhere, evaluation reflects a wide variety of concerns. In traditional journals, as perverted by the commercial circuits, citation chasing ability is part of the evaluation. Prestige is part of the evaluation. But evaluation could also include alignment with the objectives of the research program that implements a national science policy. Evaluation could imply values that may come from various sectors of society, such as worries about the environment, worries about inequities, and so on. It can also include interest for the possible impact of a piece of work on the theoretical framework of a discipline, while validation asks if the claims for new knowledge are serious. Evaluation wonders what they are good for and for whom. To go back to the inside-out library concept, validation and evaluation appear as soon as work is exposed, but it is clear that libraries are not the right institution to fulfill these functions. However, libraries can be very useful in creating the needed infrastructures to perform validation tests, and evaluation assessments. As for the funding agencies, they can certainly play a fundamental role in assisting in the establishment of appropriate forms of governance overlooking validation and evaluation. They could also help in the financing, by the way, so as to ensure that these fundamental processes return under the full control of the research communities, which is no longer the case, unhappily. This is where the notion of platform becomes crucial. If indeed platforms manage human-to-document interactions, document-to-document interactions, and the return impact of documents on human relationships, then the ways in which documents are validated, placed in relation to other documents, and the way in which they affect future scientific research show the strategic position of platforms and the multiple roles they can play. It also shows the importance of having libraries and funding agencies working closely together to design and maintain platforms that are suited for their societies, their countries, their regions, their problems, their resources. Finally, it also means that the split long observed between research funding and research publishing can come to an end. Libraries and funding agencies can join forces to create a complete research arc that fully incorporates the publishing phase, thus finally correcting the problem of a scientific publishing system that diverges from scientific communication and its inherent needs. The great conversation would see its elements finally correctly realigned as they used to be in the 19th century. Next slide. What about journals? It is easy to imagine a world where platforms harbor what I like to call crystals of knowledge, as a generic term for articles and monographs, being the more common form of these. However, there is nothing to be said for journals in this world of interconnected platforms. There is something if we can correct the problematic transformation of journals engineered by commercial firms in the second half of the 20th century. In other words, if we want journals on platforms, we have to reshape journals to a position much closer to the position in which they were well before the Second World War. If we return to the notions of journal in the 18th and 19th centuries, and even at the beginning of the 20th century, we can readily see how close they were to specific communities. We can also see that their relationship with what they publish is not so much one of property. They are not seeking to make money from their articles. Rather, they are concerned with issues of provenance. The articles that appear under the title of a particular journal reflect the interest and perspective of a particular and relatively stable group of trustable people. In effect, they contribute to the diversity needed in knowledge production. Platforms can include such journals. In fact, given the enormous importance presently granted to journals, it would probably be impossible to move forward without them, at least for a while. This is a signpost that is too common nowadays to be given easily. However, journals can be treated a little differently if the notion of property of their intellectual content is abandoned. Let us treat a journal as a source of provenance. Such and such an article presently is associated in a biology journal is also associated with a group of agricultural journals, but the original provenance, as well as the various journals with which it is increasingly associated, are also available and visible. Obviously, articles or other forms of what I call crystals of knowledge appearing in a variety of these journals would thereby demonstrate the richness and the importance of their intellectual value and contribution beside their basic and crucial scientific validity. Such a system would allow all kinds of problems to find their communities without encountering the risk of being marginalized for not pursuing problems privileged by a few institutions, important individuals, or prestigious, in quotation marks, publishing venues. And now I come to the conclusion. Resolving the tensions between scientific communication and the inherent needs of the great conversation on the one hand, and scientific publishing on the other hand, is probably one of the deepest and most difficult problems to solve in the present world of research. Part of the difficulties encountered in meeting with this problem are clearly socio-political and economic in nature. Very powerful publishing houses with duties to investors and deeply commercial objectives have reshaped the landscape of world research. Patterns of exclusion and marginalization, coupled with huge efforts to maintain the control of global research in the hands of a few, are the obstacles to overcome. In the North Atlantic countries, the process has gone so far that change has become extremely difficult, if not impossible. However, the majority of humanity still stands outside these regions and these patterns. And Latin America is particularly present in a system which can ultimately offer a powerful and viable alternative to the oligopoly of the major international commercial publishers. The presence of strong platforms in Latin America, such as 𝗪𝗂, Redalyc, La Referencia, 𝗥cie, and others, with thousands of journals and hundreds of thousands of articles, is the basis to restart a system of scientific publishing that aligns with the needs of scientific communication. Other parts of the world are listening and observing. For example, India right now is paying much attention to Latin America. Future networks involving a large majority of humanity all over the world may yet offer a research environment which will serve knowledge rather than capital. Thank you very much. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Jean-Claude, for your very enlightening conference. There's a lot of people in the chat posting their questions, saying thank you. Jimena Miranda, 𝗍𝗲𝗂𝗂𝗏 𝗏𝗂𝗏𝗂𝗏, they're very thankful for your ideas and all the challenges that you posed for people that work in academic journals and people that are researchers as well, like how you communicate like as a researcher, how you communicate what is going on with your research. So I think there's a lot of, I see some people that I know that work in academic journals and they're very thankful. So thank you so much. I'm going to perform the questions in Spanish. So Jean-Claude, if you could put the translation service for you to understand what are the questions. If you don't, let me know. Okay, so there's a question from the audience, and I'm going to say it in Spanish. María Emilia Víctor de Oliveira pregunta, ¿cómo podría la información científica correctamente validada ser difundida de una manera más amplia y accesible, traspasando las barreras de la academia para ampliar su alcance e incluso ayudar a reducir la información errónea o falsa?
This is the crucial question, which in effect rests on, you might say, the skewing effects of the impact factor and the citation chasing situation that is prevailing nowadays. I'm going back to the the funding agencies that finance research. They exist to implement a science policy for their country or their region. They rely on evaluations, and I mean evaluations, not validation, evaluation that are resting on the impact factor. The results of the evaluations through the impact factor diverge from in the evaluation from what they would have done had they used their own criteria to evaluate the work submitted for financing to their particular institution. And the result is that the circle continues with countries continuing to finance research which is organized from an oligopoly of laboratories and publications, and not from the science policy of the country itself. Now, the problem that one has to see very clearly is that not subscribing to the main, most, let's say, prestigious and most popular problems in the North Atlantic is not a proof of bad work, far from it. If you want to work on, say, Ebola, the Ebola virus, it took years and years to attract attention of the North to this problem. The same with malaria, with the dengue fever, and countless other problems. Countries have a right to establish priorities in problems which actually are very useful to those countries and respond to their need to finance that. Now, at the same time, doing that is not disengaging from world science. You're just widening the base out of which questions can be raised, and at the conceptual level, broadening the base of the research is going to enrich the quality of the narratives that will be constructed ultimately. So in effect, by opening up the problems to more than a small group of labs and publications defined, you are going to make science grow higher and broader than you ever did, while responding better to the needs of the real world and not just a few in the North Atlantic. That is my general answer to that.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. We have another question here. Sorry, en español. Jean-Claude, tú dijiste algo respecto a, claramente, a las bibliotecas universitarias en general. ¿Cuál sería su rol en las plataformas, el rol para salir del dominio de las editoriales comerciales? Pero quizás haciéndolo un poco más, bajándolo un poco más, ¿cuál crees tú que debería ser el rol de los bibliotecarios y las bibliotecarias, y cuáles son las competencias que estos bibliotecarios y bibliotecarias deberían tener para poder producir estos necesarios cambios?
Thank you for a very good question. This question really is at the center of, you might say, the socio-political difficulties of affecting the change, because librarians tend to think that it cannot do all that much in this area. I think if they're aligning themselves with the funding agencies, as they have jointly all the money that goes into research at all levels, they could already have a very strong voice in defining, the size and the importance of the platform. But the first most important role the librarians can do is act as the projecting of the local publications to the whole world by this inside-out concept that 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗀𝗏 developed at some point. I apologize, the sun is really getting into my face right now. I'm going to move slightly. So the first role the librarians can do is really collect the local production and show it to the world in, of course, agreement with other parts of the universities, in order to make sure that they don't become the dictators of knowledge projection in the university. They just are good helpers to project that to the world. They can also organize that knowledge. Librarians know very well how to organize knowledge. They can organize navigation tools. so that people can more easily find and find their ways in this information. And that would become all the more important if these libraries network effectively with each other on a large international scale to create a one-stop network where people would go in and find the navigational tools that could help them find information. Let me give a very simple and easy first example of that. Universities generally have a fair amount of control over the PhD theses they produce. Now, PhD theses are publications which are somewhere in between formal and informal publications, but let's use them for the moment because universities do have control over them. Suppose all the universities put in a very concerted effort, and they have already started doing that, the collection of their theses online. But going one step further, they start organizing algorithms in order to find out which thesis has some analogy with another thesis. And the analogies could be at many, many, many levels, co-citations, co-words, whatever. You have all kinds of machine reading techniques to bring texts closer or farther away to each other, depending on the criteria you use. And this is really a lot of work to do there, and it's exciting work. And if you do that, then you can start helping these young researchers identify other young researchers elsewhere that are interested in the same thing as them. So then you can start helping creating actually emerging, living communities of researchers that can start putting themselves together into some orderly fashion and move forward. Now, if you start testing these tools on this kind of corpus, this kind of material, then you can extend it to everything later on, and then you start having all the navigational and organizational tools that actually presently many publishers claim that they are developing. Librarians can do that work, at least as well as publishers. I mean, in terms of evaluation, publishers are in no better position than librarians. Evaluations are done by researchers. The point is to mobilize the researchers in the system organized by the librarians and the funding agencies, not by the commercial publishers. That's the big difference to achieve. La burguesia compradora, which has been organized by commercial publishers, somehow must be reintegrated within the real research communities, not the commercial systems.
Thank you, Jean-Claude. Gracias por una tan buena respuesta que nos diste. En el chat están valorando mucho las opciones que nos ofrecías respecto a las tesis de PhD. También felicitan mucho todas tus ideas que son miradas desafiantes y miradas revolucionarias, así que muy bienvenido en el público chileno y latinoamericano. Lamentablemente el tiempo nos tomó y no podemos seguir con las ideas. Vamos a invitar al público, a las personas del chat, que ya el público, Jean-Claude, y a todos les cuento que estamos en 573 participantes, así que es una gran audiencia que te pudo escuchar hoy. Verónica Peña dice que es una muy buena presentación, María Rivero también, Dina Armijo, Carla Rivera también te felicita, e invitamos a toda la audiencia a seguirte en Twitter y poder revisar también el trabajo que has hecho anteriormente. Y muchas gracias de nuevo, Jean-Claude. Esperamos que podamos seguir en contacto, y bueno, ahí puedes ver en el chat toda la gente que está apreciando mucho todas tus ideas. Pero quedamos acá, vamos a pasar a un video, y eso, nos despedimos, Jean-Claude. Que estés bien, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Gracias a ti. Nos vemos. Quedamos en contacto. Chao.